At the reading of my grandfather's will, my aunt scoffed. He would never leave you anything. You were just his charity case. The lawyer cleared his throat, surveyed me, and said, actually, he left everything to the person who did the most. After hearing that, the entire room went silent. I never expected to inherit anything from my grandfather. Growing up as the accident in a family of high achievers, I'd learned to keep my expectations low. My cousins had fancy degrees and six-figure jobs while I worked construction and lived in a studio apartment across town. But when the lawyer called about Grandpa's will reading, something told me I should be there. The law office felt suffocating. Mahogany panels lined the walls, and the air smelled like old money and disappointment. My aunt sat in the front row, her designer handbag clutched tight, whispering urgently to her daughter. My uncle paced by the window, checking his phone every few seconds. They'd all driven here in cars worth more than I made in 2 years. I took a seat in the back, wearing my only decent shirt and feeling completely out of place. The lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, shuffled through papers while we waited. My aunt kept glancing back at me with that familiar look of disdain I'd grown accustomed to over the years. When everyone had arrived, the lawyer began reading the standard legal language about Grandpa's final wishes. I zoned out, thinking about the last time I'd seen the old man. He'd been in the hospital, tubes running everywhere, but his eyes were still sharp. I'd visited him every day for 3 weeks, even though it meant losing pay from the construction site. The rest of the family had been too busy with their important lives to spend much time there. My aunt cleared her throat loudly when the lawyer mentioned my name among the beneficiaries. She turned around and looked directly at me, her voice cutting through the formal atmosphere like a blade. She told me not to get my hopes up because Grandpa would never leave me anything meaningful. According to her, I was just his charity case, the family member he felt sorry for. Her daughter giggled, and my uncle nodded in agreement. Heat rushed to my face, but I stayed quiet. This wasn't new. They'd been treating me like a burden since my parents died, when I was 12 and Grandpa took me in. They never let me forget that I didn't belong, that I was different from their successful children. The lawyer cleared his throat and surveyed the room, his eyes settling on me. Then he said something that made the entire room go silent. According to Grandpa's will, he was leaving everything to the person who had done the most for him and for others without expecting anything in return. My aunt's face went white. She demanded to know what that meant, her voice shaking. The lawyer continued reading, explaining that Grandpa had been observing all of us for years, documenting our actions and motivations. He'd kept detailed notes about who visited him, who helped him with daily tasks, and who showed genuine care versus obligation. The lawyer pulled out a thick folder and began reading excerpts from Grandpa's journal. Entry after entry detailed how I'd driven him to doctor appointments when no one else could make time, how I'd fixed his leaky roof last summer without being asked, how I'd stayed with him during his chemotherapy sessions, holding his hand while he threw up. But it went deeper than that. Grandpa had also been watching how he treated others outside the family. He'd documented my uncle's habit of screaming at waiters and my aunt's tendency to look down on anyone she considered beneath her social status. He'd noted my cousin's complete indifference to homeless people and their constant complaints about having to tip service workers. Meanwhile, he'd observed me helping my elderly neighbor with her groceries every week. He'd seen me volunteer at the community center on weekends, teaching kids basic carpentry skills. He'd noticed that I always tipped generously, even when money was tight, and that I treated everyone with respect regardless of their job or background. The lawyer continued reading, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. Grandpa had left me the house, the lake cabin, the stock portfolio, and the business he'd built from nothing. Everything. The estimated value was over $3 million. My aunt shot up from her chair, screaming that this was impossible. She'd been taking care of Grandpa for years, she claimed, visiting him regularly and making sure he had everything he needed. The lawyer calmly pointed out that according to the documentation, her last visit before his final illness had been 6 months prior, and that had been to ask for money to pay off her credit cards. My uncle joined in, arguing that I'd manipulated a sick old man. He threatened to contest the will, claiming I'd used undue influence. The lawyer smiled slightly and explained that Grandpa had anticipated this reaction. He'd been mentally evaluated by 3 different doctors over the past year, all of whom had declared him completely competent. He'd also recorded video testimonials explaining his reasoning, which would be very difficult to challenge in court. As the family erupted in accusations and threats, I sat in stunned silence. I'd never expected this, never dreamed that my simple acts of kindness would be noticed or valued. I'd helped Grandpa because I loved him, because he'd saved me when I had nothing. The idea that he'd been keeping track, that he'd seen something worthwhile in me, was overwhelming. My cousin finally spoke up, her voice dripping with venom. She accused me of being a gold digger, of pretending to care about Grandpa just to get his money. She said I'd never belonged in this family anyway, and now I was trying to steal what rightfully belonged to them. The lawyer held up his hand for silence and continued reading. There was more. Grandpa had also left specific instructions for how I should handle my newfound wealth. He wanted me to use it wisely, to continue helping others, and to remember that money couldn't buy character. He'd also included a provision that if any family member contested the will, their portion of what little remained would be donated to charity. But the biggest surprise was still coming. The lawyer pulled out a sealed envelope that Grandpa had instructed him to read only after everything else. Inside was a letter addressed to me, which the lawyer read aloud to the entire room. Grandpa's final message explained that he'd never married or had children by choice. He'd built his fortune through hard work and careful investments, always planning to leave it to someone who would use it properly. Over the years, he'd watched his adopted family, hoping one of them would prove worthy. But they'd all disappointed him with their greed, their entitlement, and their lack of compassion for others. Then he'd taken me in, a scared 12-year-old who'd lost everything. He'd watched me grow up, seen how I handled adversity without becoming bitter. He'd noticed that despite having so little, I'd always been willing to share what I had. The letter detailed specific examples, how I'd given my lunch money to a classmate whose family couldn't afford school meals, how I'd worked extra shifts to help pay for my cousin's college textbooks even though she'd never thanked me. The letter concluded with Grandpa explaining that I was the son he'd never had, the one person in the family who'd inherited what really mattered, not his money, but his values. He'd decided years ago that I would be his sole heir, but he'd wanted to wait until he was gone to reveal it, knowing it would cause exactly the reaction we were witnessing now. The room erupted again. My aunt accused the lawyer of fabricating the letter. My uncle threatened to have me investigated for elder abuse. My cousin screamed that I'd brainwashed a senile old man. But their protests fell on deaf ears. The lawyer calmly explained that everything had been properly witnessed and notarized, with multiple copies stored in different locations. As the family continued their tantrum, I finally stood up. I thanked the lawyer and walked toward the door, ignoring the continued threats and accusations behind me. My aunt grabbed my arm as I passed, hissing that this wasn't over, that they'd find a way to prove I'd manipulated Grandpa. I gently removed her hand and told her I was sorry she felt that way. Update 1. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal challenges and family drama. True to their word, my aunt and uncle hired an expensive lawyer to contest the will. They claimed Grandpa had been suffering from dementia and that I'd isolated him from his real family. They painted me as a predatory opportunist who'd taken advantage of a vulnerable elderly man. Their lawyer was impressive, I'll give him that. He argued that the dramatic disparity in the will was evidence of manipulation. He questioned why someone would leave everything to a construction worker while cutting out successful family members. He suggested that I'd used my daily presence in Grandpa's life to gradually poison him against his other relatives. But their case fell apart quickly. Grandpa's medical records showed no signs of cognitive decline. His 3 separate mental competency evaluations were thorough and recent. More damaging to their case, the lawyer produced Grandpa's journals, which dated back over 15 years and showed a consistent pattern of disappointment with their behavior. The journals revealed things I'd never known. How my aunt had tried to convince Grandpa to sell his house and move to a nursing home so she could access his money sooner. How my uncle had borrowed $50,000 for a business investment that turned out to be gambling debts. How my cousins had only visited when they needed something, usually money for their expensive lifestyles. In contrast, the journals documented my relationship with Grandpa in detail. Every conversation we'd had about life, work, and values. Every time I'd helped him without being asked. Every occasion when I'd chosen to spend time with him instead of going out with friends my own age. It painted a picture of a genuine relationship built on mutual respect and love. The most damaging evidence against my family came from Grandpa's security cameras. Apparently, he'd installed them throughout his house years ago for safety reasons, but they'd captured much more than he'd expected. The footage showed my aunt going through his medicine cabinet during visits, apparently checking what medications he was taking. It showed my uncle searching through Grandpa's desk drawers when he thought no one was looking. Most telling was a recording from my cousin's last visit, where she'd spent the entire time on her phone, barely acknowledging Grandpa's attempts at conversation. When he'd mentioned feeling lonely, she'd suggested he get a pet instead of bothering family members who had their own lives to live. Meanwhile, the cameras showed hours of footage of me and Grandpa working on puzzles, watching old movies, and just talking. They captured moments of genuine connection that no amount of money could fake. The way I'd help him when he struggled with his arthritis, how I'd patiently listen to the same stories he'd tell repeatedly, how I'd make sure he took his medications properly. Their lawyer tried one last desperate strategy, arguing that even if Grandpa was competent, the will was still unfair and contrary to normal family expectations. The judge shut that down immediately, explaining that people have the right to distribute their assets however they choose, as long as they're mentally competent. The will was upheld in its entirety. My family's legal challenge cost them nearly $100,000 in attorney fees, money they could have used for their own needs instead of trying to steal what wasn't theirs. Update 2. 6 months after the will reading, my life had changed in ways I never imagined. I'd quit construction and enrolled in business school, something I'd always wanted to do but could never afford. Grandpa's final letter had included advice about managing wealth responsibly, including the recommendation to get proper education before making any major financial decisions. The house felt strange at first. Growing up there, I'd always seen it as Grandpa's space, somewhere I was graciously allowed to exist. Now it was mine, and I was slowly making it feel like home. I'd kept all of Grandpa's furniture and personal items, especially his workshop in the garage where he'd taught me basic carpentry skills. I'd also started the charitable foundation that Grandpa had suggested in his letter. We focused on helping kids who'd lost their parents, providing them with educational opportunities and mentorship programs. It felt like the right way to honor his memory and continue the values he'd tried to instill in me. The rest of the family had gone completely silent. No more angry phone calls or threatening letters from their lawyer. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that they were struggling financially after their failed legal challenge, but I felt no satisfaction in their difficulties. If anything, it made me sad that things had deteriorated so badly. I tried reaching out to my youngest cousin, the one who'd always been quieter during family gatherings. She was only 19 and still in college, and I wondered if she might be different from her parents and older siblings. I'd sent her a letter explaining that the foundation was offering scholarships and that I'd be happy to help with her education expenses if she was interested. She never responded, but I wasn't surprised. The family had probably closed ranks against me, painting me as the villain who'd stolen their inheritance. In their minds, I was sure they'd convinced themselves that they were the real victims in this situation. But I'd also made new connections that more than compensated for the family I'd lost. The volunteer work at the community center had introduced me to people who valued character over bank accounts. I'd started dating someone I'd met there, a teacher who worked with underprivileged kids. She understood my background and appreciated that I hadn't let sudden wealth change who I was fundamentally. The business school classmates were a mixed bag. Some were clearly just there because their families expected it, while others had worked hard to earn their spots. I found myself gravitating toward the latter group, people who understood struggle and appreciated opportunity. My professors were fascinated by my background and my plans for the foundation. Several had offered to help me structure it properly, ensuring that the money would have maximum impact. It was rewarding to work with people who shared Grandpa's belief that wealth should be used to help others rather than just accumulate more wealth. Update 3. A year after Grandpa's death, I received an unexpected visitor. My aunt showed up at the house unannounced, looking tired and defeated. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater that had seen better days. She asked if we could talk, and despite everything that had happened, I invited her in. She sat in Grandpa's old chair and looked around the living room, taking in all the familiar details that hadn't changed. Then she started talking, and what came out wasn't what I'd expected. She apologized, not just for contesting the will, but for how she'd treated me my entire life. She admitted that she'd been jealous of my relationship with Grandpa, resentful that he'd seemed to prefer me over his own nieces and nephews. She explained that their family had been struggling financially for years, living beyond their means and accumulating debt to maintain their lifestyle. They'd been counting on Grandpa's inheritance to solve their problems, which was why they'd reacted so badly to the will. The failed legal challenge had pushed them into bankruptcy, and her husband had left her for someone younger and wealthier. But what surprised me most was her admission that reading Grandpa's journals during the legal proceedings had forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about herself. She'd realized that everything he'd written about her behavior was accurate, and that she'd never actually treated him with the love and respect he deserved. She told me about finding some of her old letters to Grandpa in her belongings, letters she'd written as a child when her family had lived far away. They were full of genuine affection and promises to visit soon. Somewhere along the way, she'd lost that connection, replacing it with obligation and eventually resentment when he'd become more of a burden than a resource. I listened without interrupting, trying to process this different side of someone I'd seen as purely antagonistic for so long. When she finished talking, she asked if there was any way I could help her daughter with college expenses. Not as family, she clarified, but as someone who might be willing to give a struggling student a chance despite her family's mistakes. I thought about Grandpa and what he would have wanted. He'd always believed in redemption, in the possibility that people could change and grow. I told her I'd consider it, but that any help would come with conditions. Her daughter would need to apply through the foundation like any other applicant, demonstrating both need and merit. There would be no special treatment because of family connections, but no automatic disqualification either. She agreed immediately, tears streaming down her face. She thanked me and apologized again, admitting that she finally understood why Grandpa had chosen me. It wasn't about manipulation or favoritism. It was about character, consistency, and the way someone treats others when they think no one is watching. After she left, I sat in Grandpa's chair and thought about forgiveness and second chances. I'd inherited more than money from him. I'd inherited his values and his belief in human potential. Maybe this was another test, another opportunity to prove worthy of the trust he'd placed in me. 3 months later, my cousin submitted her scholarship application. Her essay was honest about her family's mistakes and her own role in the dysfunction. She wrote about watching the will reading and realizing for the first time how poorly they'd all treated both Grandpa and me. She detailed her plans to study social work, inspired by seeing how the foundation was helping kids like she wished she'd been helped. The foundation's review board, which included several community leaders and education professionals, voted unanimously to approve her scholarship. But they also required her to volunteer at the community center as part of the program, ensuring she'd understand the value of service to others. I never told her I was involved in the decision. She earned that scholarship through her own merit and genuine commitment to change. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's becoming someone so successful and generous that your former enemies have no choice but to respect what you've built. Grandpa would have been proud. The scared 12-year-old he'd taken in had grown into someone who could break cycles of resentment and create opportunities for others. The money he'd left me was just a tool. The real inheritance was the wisdom to use it properly and the character to stay true to his values even when it would be easier to give in to bitterness. That night, I pulled out the last letter Grandpa had left for me, one the lawyer had given me privately after the family left the reading. In it, he'd written that he'd always known I'd face challenges from the family, but he'd trusted me to handle them with grace. He'd reminded me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the positive impact we have on others' lives. Looking around the house that was now truly mine, filled with memories of the man who'd saved me and shaped me, I knew I'd made him proud. The real victory wasn't inheriting his money. It was proving worthy of his faith and using that inheritance to help others the way he'd helped me.